you broke down what at times is a very complex considerations, right? You know, and I like the fact that you ended that with the kind of the use case being that fourth factor. So because it actually tees up what my question for Christine. So Christine, obviously you've had experience working in large companies and dealing with AI in those spheres. So how does a large company think about AIs or ethics in AI?
Yeah, and I think Reed started down a great journey on this, and it's a really an important question right now and challenge that I'm frequently hearing about, and actually is one of the challenges, like I said, I'm excited to help solve for the private and public sector of Protiviti here. But so I think when people ask that questions of ethics and AI, the main topic that we hear a lot is what Reed said is the first one he brought up is the bias. And so, but there's different definitions out there in bias, right? And so for the purposes of our talk, I'd really like to define bias as a result or a prediction that is systematically predisposed or partial due to faulty assumptions, which is exactly the examples that Reed gave when he was talking. And then in many cases, that bias, again, can cause us to miss those relevant relationships. But if you break down how machine AI ML is done, right, and machine learning is done, right, there's different steps that have to happen. And each of those steps, you have to take the ethics into consideration. And that's how the big companies are looking at this, right, of in each step. So you have data prep, right? You have train and tuning, and then you have deploy and monitoring the models. And so in each of those steps, the big companies are trying to put risks and compliance into to lower the risk and put compliance methods into each of those steps to remove the biases, to take account for the privacy and the privacy regulations, right, that are around depending on which state you're in, right, and where you're operating, right, and to open up that black box, right, so that it is more transparent. And so just for the call too, so we understand when we're talking about data prep, right, that's the collection of the data, that's preparing the data, which includes the cleaning of it, the normalizing it, the tagging of it, which bias can again come into that. It comes into the pre-processing of that data prior to it even being put into the model. And then once that step's done, right, there's training and tuning. So when you're training the data, right, working through it, running scripts through it, and then validating that, experimenting with it, and then tuning it, right, to make sure that the model actually is hitting the accuracy rates you're looking for, and then deploying and monitoring. So even after you deploy and monitor, you still have to test that data, right, and make sure it's happening. And then you still need to check for drift in that model as it goes and have to retrain, right? You have to continuously retrain your models as well. So as the big companies are thinking about ethics, they're thinking about every single stage in there, right? And how the continuous monitoring to detect this bias and concept drift in the data, how they need to get past that, right? And so really you need to develop a framework and maintain that framework around it to balance that risk and ensure, you know, via your compliance methods and your policies and the regulations, you're able to identify those imbalances in the data while checking those trained models for the bias and really monitor the models, right? And ensure that you understand your model, again, opening up that black box. And the other point that really needs to be made here is even if you're not a large company, but you're purchasing like as a third-party vendor from those companies, you really should be conducting those third-party risk assessments to make sure that they are actually considering the ethics in those models. Because once you deploy those into your own environment, you're assuming that risk, right? That is, the risk is transferred over, and you really need to take a look at that and as you're deploying those so that you can actually reduce and know what your risk is so you can better manage it across. And so that is an area, again, of growing, you know, growth and questions we get a lot within the companies and within the public sector around AI ML.